This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at javascriptjabber.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, well, it's me, Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and we have a special guest this week, and that's Evan Hahn. Evan, do you want to say hi?
Hi, my name is Evan Hahn. Yeah, I'm a developer. I work on, I think I'm being interviewed for stuff about Helmet.js.
Yep, it looks like a cool project. Yeah, and I don't know where everybody else is. Apparently everybody's gone, including me. I'm at ngconf. So if you're an Angular type, then you've heard of ngconf probably. And so I'm here interviewing speakers, and Evan is doing whatever Evan does every day. So yeah, do you want to just give a brief introduction as far as like who you are, who you work for, that kind of stuff, so people can get a feel for who you are?
Yeah, sure. So this is my second day at a new job at a company called Airtable, and they build a spreadsheet application that you can. It's powerful enough that you can like make little applications with, and so I think that stuff is kind of cool. I'm happy to talk more about that. But yeah, today's only my second day, so I'm not really too well versed in all the process and stuff like that. And then prior to that, I spent 3 years at a company called Braintree, which is owned by PayPal, and they do payment processing for companies like Airbnb and Dropbox and GitHub. That pitch I can do a little bit better than the Airtable pitch, I think.
Yeah, they're a little better known to the Braintree folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been doing JavaScript for many, many years. I've lost count, but yeah, I took over Helmet from Adam Baldwin, a prior guest on this show a few years ago. And then, I've been maintaining it ever since.
Sounds good. So do you want to give us just the 5-second elevator pitch on Helmet.js and what it's for, what it does?
Yeah, sure. So if you're building a web application with Node, you're probably using Express. And that's not the only choice, but that's a very common choice. If you're building a web application, I think that you should pay some attention to security. I think I could hammer the nail in about, breaches and hacking and all that stuff. But yeah, that stuff is important. But that stuff is often kind of tricky to implement. So, it takes a long time. You have to have a deep understanding of how things work, that sort of stuff. And I don't think that there's a way around some of that stuff, but there are certain really quick wins that you can get on an Express application that are very, very quick to do, and you don't really have to understand them, and they're never going to cause a problem. Just like you should just kind of do them. And that's where Helmet comes in. So it is a middleware for Express applications that aims to be really, really quick to use. You don't really have to understand what it's doing, other than the fact that it offers you some basic security benefits. I want to stress that it's not you use Helmet and your app is secure. It's more defense in depth sort of stuff. So it gives you some quick wins, but it doesn't make your application secure. I don't ever want to say that.
Oh, come on. I was looking for the silver bullet.
Yeah, I think in the README I wrote, it's not a silver bullet. Yeah. So unfortunately, it's not a silver bullet, but hopefully it can be helpful.
Cool. Well, you talk about security, and then you mentioned that it's a middleware for Express. So I kind of grew up as a Ruby on Rails developer, and we have a system that does security checks for your code called Brakeman, but it does it through static analysis. So why would you use the approach of doing middleware as opposed to, something like static analysis where it says, hey, these are some common security issues in Express, don't do these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that, again, like Helmet is not the only solution. So I think static analysis...
the best one, right?
It's just 100% the best. There we go. Yeah, but it's useful for setting HTTP headers, and if you don't know what that is, every time you ever make an HTTP request, loading an image or a web page or a piece of JavaScript or whatever, there's the actual HTML content or the JavaScript content or the JPEG bytes or whatever. But then there's also metadata that goes along with that request, and that metadata can be whatever. It's a key value thing. So I think the most commonly known HTTP header that I can think of is the user agent header. Your browser sends that header and it says, hey, I'm Firefox 1.2.3 or whatever. Hopefully you're not using that older version of Firefox, but that's the idea. And certain headers, if browsers see them in the response, they act differently, and they'll often do good things. So, for example, there is one that prevents certain kinds of cross-site scripting attacks, or it helps to prevent those. And without getting into what a cross-site scripting attack is, it's just something bad that you don't want to happen to your site. And there are certain HTTP headers that can help basically tell browsers, hey, like, don't let some of these kinds of attacks happen.
Right. Those are usually centered around the refer domain or things like that, right? For the scripting.
So a lot of these cross-site scripting attacks kind of are basically like running JavaScript on your page that you do not want to run on your page. And so sometimes, you can do weird stuff with refer stuff. And then there's lots of other dangerous things you can do with cross-site scripting attacks.
Yep. So that's interesting. Did you build Helmet, or are you just the current maintainer?
A little of both. It was built originally by Adam Baldwin, and he's a security guy in the Node space. Actually, I think his company just got acquired by NPM. So congrats to him. And he didn't want to maintain Helmet anymore, and I had issued a number of pull requests to it. And so then he basically transferred ownership to me, and now I run the project, and I've been running it for a few years. He wrote the original core of it, and I added a bunch of stuff to it. So I think most of the lines of code are now written by me, but he definitely like started the project.
Very cool. Yeah, and it's a lot of work maintaining a project. So I think everybody who uses it or benefits from it on a website that they use are probably grateful you put that time in.
Well, I hope it's useful. It has enough downloads that I feel like some people are at least downloading it and hopefully using it. So hopefully it's helpful.
Yep. So I'm a little bit curious. So you set it up as middleware. What kinds of things are you looking for then? You're just looking for HTTP headers, or is there more to it?
So Helmet doesn't. It all it does is set outbound HTTP response headers. So there's a slight asterisk to what I just said, but for the most part, it sets like security related headers. One of them, for example, is called IE no open. And there's a header called X download options, X hyphen download hyphen options. And it has one value, no open. And it's not a super common attack, but some old versions of Internet Explorer will act differently if trying to download an HTML file. It's kind of an obscure attack, but the way you prevent it is by adding this outbound header, and then old versions of Internet Explorer will see this and say, "Oh, like I'm not gonna try to do anything weird with this HTML," and does like the normal write secure thing. And it's trivial to add this header, and you just include Helmet and you get it. And in other web frameworks and in other similar modules, it's trivial to add as well. And it's a trivial thing to write yourself. Like, I don't want to pretend like Helmet is some beautiful masterpiece, but more like it's just an understanding of which HTTP headers you should probably be setting. That's the novel part.
Yeah, but the thing is you're talking about this one instance, and what I find is, there are a whole bunch of these known issues out there. And so if Helmet handles, 60, 70, 80, 90 of them, right? Or, even 20 of them that I don't have to think about. All I have to do is install an NPM package. That's really helpful. Even if I could go write 20 middlewares to handle each one.
Yeah. And Again, I want to stress that like if you use Helmet, your app isn't secure, but it does prevent certain kinds of attacks that are less obscure. That it at least helps prevent some kinds of attacks that are less obscure than this weird old Internet Explorer one.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, is it as simple as just setting up the middleware and it just inspects the outgoing HTTP headers on every request, or does it only do it on some of them? And yeah, does it just look at it and say, that's a bad header, don't do that?
So it actually, it doesn't look at anything. It doesn't check if your code is secure. That there are other helpful tools to do that, like the Ruby one you mentioned. But what it does basically is for every response that Helmet is going to respond to, which the way it's documented is every response, although Express lets you configure that. But for every response,
for certain responses,
right? Exactly.
Okay.
And so for everything that Helmet is going to respond to, it will just basically blindly set these HTTP headers. Some of them are really, really simple. It's just like always set this header always this way. Some of them are a little more complicated, like set it this way if the browser looks like this, or certain options are configurable. So some of them are not. Some of them are like there's only one thing you're ever going to set it to, and it's just going to make your life easier. Some of them are things like there's a thing called HTTP strict transport security, where basically you say, and I'm going to be a bit hand wavy here, but basically you say, hey, you always want to be visiting the HTTPS secure version of this site, never the HTTP insecure version of this site. So like, don't ever come back to the HTTP version of this site for 30 days or whatever you want to say. And that once you configure that number, Helmet will set that basically unconditionally, but you have to configure like how long you want it to set that header for. Again, I'm being a little hand wavy, and we can go into more specifics about that, but that's the idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So it just sets these headers to sort of the default, or if there's some conditional something or other to worry about with it, it'll do that. But are there instances where you wouldn't want to use Helmet?
Yeah, so I mean, Helmet is it's a collection of 12 smaller middleware functions. So Helmet itself, the actual Helmet package, basically just calls out to these 12 other packages. And there's a little more complicated than that, but it's basically that. And then each of those packages is responsible for basically one HTTP header. Again, like some of the specific ones manage multiple ones, or it's configurable out which one you want to set. But basically, each one corresponds to one. And then some of them are in like the default. So if you do the one-liner app.use Helmet, you say, I want to use Helmet in my Express app. It picks some default ones and has them on the default options, which I think are generally good for most people. And then omits some where either you need to configure them, like it is useless to, like I couldn't guess what default you might have, or it omits ones where it might not be super useful. So there's one that I think is particularly, like probably the one I would remove if I were going to remove any of them. It just completely disables caching, and that has a performance implication, right? You often want to cache stuff, but for security, there are certain things that you might say, like, well, I just want to make sure that people always have an up-to-date version of this thing, etc. And so the no cache middleware will basically eliminate all caching headers, which the browser would respect and cache responses for. So like you probably wouldn't want to include that by default, but it might be useful for certain cases. And then there are other more complex ones like content security policy, which basically is a whitelist of things that are allowed on your page. So you say like, oh, I'm only allowed to load JavaScript from this domain and this domain. And then if somebody tries to evilly load JavaScript from some evil.com domain that isn't in the whitelist, and it gets blocked. But I couldn't possibly guess what your website, looks like.
Right.
And so those aren't included by default.
That makes sense. You said that some of them are conditional. Is that just in some config file?
Well, actually, what do you mean by conditional? Like some are not always included, or
yeah, some are, they only work on certain endpoints, or some of them only load under certain circumstances. it sounded like some were configurable too, like the HTTPS thing where, come back after so many days. Mm-hmm. But where do you set those configuration options?
So there are, I would say, probably 3 ways to do it. One is if you use the top level Helmet module, you pass options as an argument to the Helmet function. Mm-hmm. And those arguments are things like enable this one, disable this one, or enable this one and set these options.
So you have some kind of setup script then?
Yeah, you would just have something where you used the middleware in your Express app. So wherever you're going to, whenever it's time to use Helmet, you'll set the options there if you want to set any.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then the other 2 ways are including the modules themselves. So they are, those 12 sub modules. You could just npm install the specific ones you care about instead of installing all of Helmet. And also, if you install all of Helmet, you can do things like helmet.ie no open to get that one header that we talked about a bit ago.
Right.
And that's very, very similar to just installing the IE no open package from npm and not the rest of Helmet.
Gotcha. So what's the thing that's most nefarious that Helmet saves you from?
I think the biggest piece of code in Helmet is the content security policy code. Content security policy is pretty complicated, it turns out, at least from my perspective. So like the first one I talked about, the IE no open one that prevents that obscure Internet Explorer bug, there's one thing you can set it to that, and this thing is fixed. Whereas content security policy is configuring that whitelist of things has a lot of hairy parts. Right. One of them is if you introduce it on an existing site, you might miss stuff. So you might say like, oh, I only want these 3 things in the whitelist.
Right.
But then somebody hits some obscure page on your app and the 4th thing should load, and it's not an evil thing, but content security policy will say, hey, this isn't allowed, and block it. And so getting that right in an existing app is tricky. And one way to do that, and GitHub has a really good post about how to introduce content security policy in an existing app. But the short of it is, one big way to do it is content security policy has a report only mode. So instead of blocking it, it will send a request to your server and say like, hey, I would have blocked this if this were a real content security policy. And a human probably has to look at that kind of log and see like, oh, like lots and lots of people would have blocked this thing that we would have introduced if we actually introduced a content security policy. Let's make sure to add it to the whitelist because it's legitimate. Or you could also see stuff like, oh, wow, lots of our users are getting cross-site scripted from evil.com. What's going on? And fix that problem also. And then when you're ready to do all that, you can introduce the real content security policy and hopefully not break anybody.
That makes sense. I could see somebody installing it and something invisible like Google Analytics or something quit working.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So like you would have, if you have Google Analytics on your site, you have to put it in the content security whitelist. Otherwise it won't load.
When you start a new project, typically you need things like a domain name, hosting, things like that. When I choose hosting, I pick mine for the options it gives. I like to know what I'm getting and set things up just how I like them. This is why for your projects, you should check out Linode. Linode servers feature native SSD storage, a 40 gigabyte network, and Intel E5 processors. That's all the power you need to run VMs under full control, or Docker containers, who doesn't love that, encrypted disks, and VPNs. Plus, they have 10 data centers across the world and add-ons like backups, Node Balancer, and Longview to help you control your server costs. They also offer block storage for your static files, and you can get started with a $20 credit if you use the code JavaScript Jabber 2018. That credit is good for 4 months on their 1 gigabyte server. That's a lot of time to try them out and see if they're the right fit for you. That code again is JavaScript Jabber 2018. Also, if you're interested in working for Linode, they're hiring. Head to linode.com/careers to see their available positions.
Yeah, I have this conversation as well with family members and friends who are looking for some way to filter the internet for their kids. And it's like, well, it just needs a more comprehensive blacklist, right? Because their kid finds some video online that has stuff they didn't want them to see. And I'm like, no, the most effective way is to whitelist stuff, right? And then if there's, they're trying to get to something that isn't in the whitelist, then you go and you okay it after you check it out. And it's kind of the same approach here, right? Where, I mean, I can go buy a domain for $10 a year. I can put some nasty code on it, and because it's not in your blacklist, it's not going to get caught. So the whitelist is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, and I found that to be true with just like not even in security, but like in API design at Braintree. We did a lot of stuff where we had a version of the code that kind of was pretty flexible and had like lots and lots of different things you could do and lots of different options. And it's not exactly a whitelist, but having a more restrictive API made it a lot easier for us as maintainers of that API, instead of trying to accept a lot of stuff or ignoring extra parameters or things like that, because people would get it wrong and not, they'd misspell something and there would be no error. They would use some ancient feature that we didn't want them to use, or they would, worst of all, they would, throw something through that caused a security vulnerability. And so I found that like having a whitelist in general is often a good policy. It's not always a good policy, but yeah, to echo what you said, I think it's a good choice. And it's what the people who created the content security policy spec thought as well, I'm sure.
Makes sense. Is this something that you used at Braintree or that you use at your current company?
Braintree was not super Node heavy. They had a few Node apps while I was there. I probably shouldn't go into specifics just in case, but they weren't. They're not a Node shop for the most part, although they have a little bit. I don't remember if they used Helmet. Their parent company, PayPal, has a competitor is the wrong word, but an alternative to Helmet that is also good. I don't really care. As long as your app is getting more secure, I'm not too particular, but I think a lot of PayPal is on Node, and they're pretty publicly behind Node. And they have something called Luska, which does a lot of what Helmet does. For the most part, they're identical, frankly. If you're like me and you spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff, there are subtle differences, but I think if you're getting some of these quick wins from HTTP headers, that's kind of the thing you want. At Airtable, I know this was a nice thing that made me feel good in the interview. When I interviewed here, they told me that they already had some of my code in production, and I thought that's scary. I don't know what that means, but they're using one of Helmet's 12 components, as far as I know. That was nice to know. So Airtable at least uses a little bit of Helmet, although not all of it. Maybe while I'm here, I'll get everybody to get everything to use it.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, is reactionary, right? Oh, we had a problem with this, so, we got DDoSed by this thing, and it turns out we can turn it off. Or, cross-site scripting, oh, we got burned and one of our customers left, so we're going to fix it. And yeah, just taking that approach and being a little bit more proactive with it makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a nice thing about, I want to stress, your app is not secure if you use Helmet, but there are certain things that are just trivial to add to your app that lower the attack surface area quite a bit. And I think Helmet is I think it's the best way to do it for an Express app, but it's certainly one of the ways to do it in an Express app. Also, if you're listening to this and you don't use Express, there are other versions of this for Rails and for Django and for lots of other things. And on the Helmet documentation page, I have a list of those if you're interested.
Very cool. So is Helmet fully tested and things like that? Or is that something you're working on these days?
Yeah, so I think as far as I know, Helmet's fully tested. The testing is pretty easy. Some of the testing is a little bit I don't spin up an actual browser to try to do some of these things to verify that the browser behaves correctly when it receives the HTTP header. That's something I've certainly considered doing, but is a monumental effort for something that I do in my spare time. And I've never run into a problem that would have been caught by that. That doesn't mean that it won't ever happen, but I have yet to receive an issue or any kind of report that's needed, especially given that I refer to some existing libraries implementations for, like, oh, is this the right value for this header? Is this documentation thing that I'm reading on the internet correct? Like, what is the version that is in Rails? What do they do? And things like that. So that is something I certainly have thought about and like, if I had infinite time, might do. But I've been very happy with the test coverage that I have, which is basically like spin up a fake server and make a fake request to it with a fake browser, and then make sure that the HTTP header response is correct.
That makes sense. So are there any things you're looking to add to Helmet?
Helmet's been pretty stable. There are a few things that I'm probably going to do in version 4.0. One of them is that the content security policy middleware does a lot of browser sniffing. So certain browsers have different support for content security policy. Sometimes things that were called this are now called this. And to make sure that stuff is as covered as possible, Helmet does browser sniffing and make sure that, like, oh, if you're on this old version of Firefox, we should rename this parameter to this parameter or something like that.
Okay.
Which is one of the things that makes content security policy difficult to implement for people. And Helmet just does all that for you. One of the things that I've been toying with is right now that browser sniffing is on by default. You can turn it off. I think in Helmet version 4, which will come out probably not soon, because Helmet's been pretty stable, but I'm going to turn that thing from on by default to off by default, and then in Helmet 5, I would turn it off completely unless I receive some issues with that. That's way down the road, but Helmet's been pretty stable, and there's nothing bigger than that I'm really wishing to add. Dropping support for old Node versions is another one, but none of that is major. It's basically removing it from my test, and now I stopped testing on old versions of Node. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing that I'm thinking of removing. But Helmet's been pretty stable. The other thing is these new HTTP security headers come through every so often. It's probably one a year ish, and kind of making sure I'm up to date with those, and when a new one comes out, adding it to Helmet to keep the surface area of attacks as low as I possibly can while keeping in the scope of the project.
Sounds good. Are you accepting contributors to Helmet? So if somebody wants to throw some pull requests your way or help with docs or things like that?
Yeah. So Helmet has a list of contributors that I think I wrote the number down somewhere. The 38 people have contributed so far. That's me, Adam Baldwin, the creator, and then 36 other people. And perhaps there are other people that I'm forgetting in that list. But there's a contributors list on Helmet's docs. And I'd love to see your name there if you want to contribute. There are a few open issues, and there are a few sort of things that could be improved. And if you're interested in getting started with something, but you don't know where to start, feel free to reach out to me. I'm Evan Hahn on everything, evanhahn.com. Me at evanhahn.com is my email. Evan Hahn on Twitter, that sort of thing. And we can try to find something cool for you to work on if you're interested in contributing. But Helmet has been relatively stable, and I'm not rewriting anything. Nothing that I know of has any glaring problems or big warts right now, because it's a relatively small module.
Do you offer advice on any other aspects of security? I mean, one thing that I'm thinking of is just a lot of times the security for your application comes down to the passwords your admins use or the way that people behave, and whether or not somebody can, call them up and get them to give up some kind of compromising information. You offer any other advice on security, or are you mostly focused on what Helmet does?
I mean, I think that's like I'm not a security professional. I've never been paid to do security work or anything like that specifically, though, thinking about security, I think is a part of being a developer in many cases. So I've certainly thought about it. One of the things that I've sort of thought about with it is that, and this is like totally unprofessional advice, so I may be totally wrong, but like the simpler a system, the less there is in it, the less likely it is to get attacked. So, like in a person's house, if you have 100 Internet of Things devices, or you like each one of those increases your attack surface area, if you're just like a person in the house. Not to say like you mustn't ever add anything to your life or to your applications, but I found that like the less there is, kind of in the whitelist blacklist discussion that we were having before, like the less that you allow, the less that you have, the fewer servers that you have, the fewer different apps that you have, the fewer different libraries that you use, the fewer lines of code you have, vaguely, the better off you'll be from a security perspective. That's a vibe I get, but again, unprofessional advice, certainly.
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I mean, the more I find that it's more complexity over necessarily more lines of code or anything else. And it's really just because it's harder to keep track of everything that's going to move through and how it's going to come in and go out. But yeah, I think you're correct on that. So yeah, I definitely am with you on that idea. One last question before we head into picks, unless there's something else that you want to cover, and that is, how do people find you on the internet? I'm usually looking for like Twitter, blog, GitHub, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I'm Evan Hahn everywhere. That's EvanHahn. And so I'm Evan Hahn on Twitter, Evan Hahn on GitHub, evanhahn.com, and my email and contact info are all on there. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me if I can be helpful at all, or if you have spam, I can take that too.
All right, cool. Well, let's go ahead and head into some picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Do you have some things you want to shout out about on the show?
Yeah, I wrote down 3. So the first is the Clojure programming language. That's something I used at Braintree previously, and it's something that I've liked a lot. I think it's really, really thoughtfully designed as a language, and I really appreciate that. A lot of its philosophy is not totally unique to Clojure, but a lot of its philosophy influenced a lot of modern JavaScript stuff. I think my sense is that the biggest thing happening in JavaScript right now is React, and a big part of React and Redux and the family is this idea of functional programming and how it makes your code simpler and less complex, kind of like we were talking about. And Clojure strives to be that way. It's like anything; it's not perfect, and it certainly has some oddities that I've noticed. But I find it a pleasure to work with, and I think working in Clojure has made me better at JavaScript. Yeah, and the creator of Clojure, Rich Hickey, has a lot of talks that I think have made me a better programmer as well. Probably my favorite one is Simple Made Easy, but the value of values is another really good talk that he gave that made my little brain swirl around a lot.
Yep.
So that's the first one, and then the second one is this thing I've just found recently, and I'm interested in working with it, but I don't really know anything about it. It's called Fortune, and it's a JavaScript library that is a database abstraction. So you basically say like, oh, like I have posts and posts have authors and, posts are posted at this time and this date and whatever. And you kind of describe the schema of your data. And then you say, I want this to live in the browser in memory, or I want this to live in the browser in IndexedDB, or I want this to live in a MySQL database, or whatever. And I think that's kind of interesting. And it seems like one of the problems that I experience when working on some applications is like you write a front end and a back end, and like a lot of the data is identical, and you just kind of want it to like work in the same structure. But yet it doesn't, either because they're in different languages, or because the paradigms of working with Postgres are very different than the paradigms of working with an in-memory array. And Fortune looks like it makes an abstraction layer on top of that would allow for a lot of shared code. And I've not used it, so I don't know if it's any good, but it looks really cool. And then the third and final is this TV show that is not at all about programming called Kantaro, the Sweet Tooth Salaryman. And it's this very stern guy who works at this desk job, and he doesn't talk to anybody, and he is very serious, and he's really, really good at his job, but no one knows anything about him, and he's very mysterious. The reason nobody knows anything about him is because he's also secretly obsessed with sweets, and so he runs around doing his sales visits, but then in between his sales visits he eats delicious food and talks about it, and it's really weird, but very good. So yeah, those are my three.
Good deal. I'm going to throw out a couple of picks. So the first pick I have is, so I'm at NGConf right now. I think I mentioned that at the start of the show, and I'm doing interviews with the speakers is what I'm here for. I know the organizers of the conference. I got Kendo UI to sponsor the interviews. And so I'm doing interviews. Anyway, so as part of the deal, I'm doing video and I'm putting them up on YouTube. And I bought a camera when I went to NG Atlanta to do this. And it turned out to have pretty awful built-in microphone. And it didn't have any kind of audio input so that I could, run a cord and, kind of override the audio. And so I got online and I found another camera that does have that. And it was actually cheaper than the first camera. It also came with a wide angle lens, which is basically like a zoom lens. And so I just, I kind of screwed that onto the front, hooked it all up. I can plug it into the wall if I want, but I don't have a mini USB. I have a whole bunch of micro USBs, but no mini USBs because nobody uses them anymore. And anyway, so I just have it set up. The camera is an OrPro camera. I got it off of Amazon. I'll put a link up in the show notes. And anyway, it's been great. And then I have my Zoom H6 and my Shure SM58 microphones that, we record on. I got a couple of 25-foot cords, XLR cords for the microphones, though I think I could have gotten away with 6-foot cords. But anyway, it's been nice to just set it up, get in, record the stuff, and get it done. So yeah, I'm looking forward to some more interviews. If you go to devchat.tv/YouTube, you can check that out. And then you also mentioned React. We have a podcast now for React called React Roundup. And, we've been interviewing a whole bunch of people in the React community. So if you're into React, check that out. And that's pretty much all I've got here. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. But thank you for coming, Evan.
Oh, yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, we'll catch everyone next week. And keep an eye out. In fact, let me just go ahead and tell you who we have scheduled for next week. Sometimes this does change, but usually it's pretty consistent. We're talking to, it's a hard name, Dotan Nahum, and we're talking about hygiene. So I'm going to have to do some homework because I don't know what that is. And then the week after that, we're talking to Kyle Simpson about functional light JavaScript. So if you're into those topics, then definitely check those out. All right. Well, thank you again, Evan.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.